Okay, all hopefully this is gonna work. Having a little bit of issues with video recorder here, but let's hope that this works. So welcome back. Today we'll be talking about chapter 3, which deals with traits, personality traits, and trait taxonomies. And when we talk about taxonomies, we can kind of think about hierarchical systems. So traits in the way that they are structured in various types of ways, right? So when we talk about trait descriptive adjectives, we're talking about words that describe traits and attributes. We call these traits and these attributes dispositions. And if you've taken social psych, you've often heard us refer to such things as dispositions, particularly when it comes to attribution theory. So when we try to attribute a cause to somebody's behaviors, we typically will make a dispositional attribution, which means that it's something about them personally that's causing them to act in such a way, or a situational attribution, which means that it's something about the environment that's causing them to act this way. So when we talk about trait descriptive adjectives, these are words that describe traits and attributions of a person that are characteristic of a person and perhaps enduring over time. And we say perhaps because there's some research that suggests that these traits tend to stick with us, but we should put an asterisk next to that, because they might be dependent on what kind of traits we're talking about, number one, and also what kind of time period in our lives that we're talking about. Traits might be more enduring earlier in life or later in life. It really kind of depends on the trait, right? But when we talk about these trait descriptive adjectives, that's what we're talking about. Words that can help us describe these personality traits or attributions or attributes or dispositions. So it raises a couple of questions here, right? Because this notion of traits are central to concepts in personality psychology. They must be precisely formulated, precisely defined, right? The whole field of personality psychology evolves around this idea that we have these types of personality traits. So we have to be clear by what we mean by these traits. So how should they be conceptualized? If you've taken a research methods class, we might have even discussed this a little bit last time, how do we operationally define some of these traits? But something like aggression, what exactly constitutes aggression? What exactly is aggression? Outgoingness, what exactly is that? What exactly is assertiveness? We need to conceptualize these traits and properly define them. And some of the taxonomies that we're going to look at today try to do that, and not just define them, but also put them in some type of meaningful order in there. So a crucial goal of personality psychology is to identify the most important ways in which people are different from one another. So how can we identify which traits are most important when we're trying to make these differences between individuals? When we're trying to tell one person apart from another, what are the traits that are most important? What should we really be focusing on? And then once the important traits have been identified, the next step will be to formulate some type of organized scheme, some type of organized hierarchy, or what we call a taxonomy, by which we can assemble these individual traits. Right? So the taxonomy will help us organize the traits in some type of meaningful way. And we can think of other types of taxonomies that exist that we're all familiar with in terms of how we label different living organisms, right? Say what kingdom they're in, what species they belong to, so on and so forth. You can tell I'm not a biologist there. But even something like the periodic table is organized in such a way that represents a particular element's atomic mass, right? It's organized in a meaningful way, and you can identify, based on which columns you're looking at, the gases and the noble gases and the metals and so on and so forth. It's not just a random table of elements in there. There's some meaning behind them, or behind their organization. And the same happens when it comes to various personality theories. So some of the definitions of a trait, well, there's really kind of two basic ways that we can think of a personality trait. So it's either something that's internal to us and it causes us to do something, right? So it's something about us that is causal. It has some type of causal properties that are involved. Or traits are just descriptive. They just describe who we are. They don't necessarily predict behaviors. They don't necessarily cause behaviors or cognitions or emotions. They just describe who we are. So we think of them as something in us that causes us to be a certain way. Or we could think of traits as kind of summaries of just who we are. Like, that's a collection of characteristics of that type of person. And you might say, well, what's the difference between them? Well, the big difference there is this term, that causal property. So their traits cause us to do certain things, or traits really just describe how we are to begin with. And we'll see that different personality psychologists and theorists have approached the notion of traits in different ways. But these are, let's say, the two basic formulations of traits. So, speaking of traits as these internal causal properties, the theories that take this approach will assume that traits are internal to us. These are our desires, our needs, our wants, and they tend to be relatively consistent between situations. So these traits are with us, they're part of who we are, and they also determine our needs, our desires, and our wants, from situation to situation. So these desires and needs are then presumed to be causal, meaning that it's our desires and our needs that are causing us to behave in certain ways. So when we think of traits as these internal causal properties, we can use traits to explain people's behaviors, because according to this model, according to this approach, it's our personality traits that are causing these behaviors. So one caveat to that is that we don't necessarily have to behave the same way all the time, because according to this perspective, traits can lie dormant. We might have certain type of personality traits that are individual to us and internal to us, but they don't always come out. Sometimes they might only come out when the situation calls for it. So even though this is seems to be more focused on heredity, and more focused on, say, like the biological aspect of traits, of personality traits, still allowing for some say social explanations in terms of how traits are expressed. So traits can lie dormant, and we might not always see certain behaviors emerge, but that doesn't mean that the traits aren't there. The traits just might not be activated yet. So when we talk about the scientific usefulness of viewing traits as causes of behaviors, um, the usefulness of it is that it lies in ruling out other type of causes, and I guess that could be good or bad for somebody who's pretty skeptical like myself. I would say that this might not be, it could be useful, but I would say, if we shouldn't consider traits as these causes of behavior as the sole explanation. But of course, that's my opinion. And there are plenty of people who disagree with me, and you very well might be one of them. I would just add to that humans are very complicated creatures. Our behaviors, emotions, cognitions change even throughout the day, even if there are patterns of stability, which we'll see throughout this class, particularly next chapter. It doesn't necessarily mean that our essence or our dispositions are going to be responsible for how we act, or quote unquote cause us to act in certain ways in every situation. But that's where the scientific usefulness comes in, that it kind of rules out other explanations of behavior. Whether you want to call that usefulness or reductive, that's up to you to decide, right? Another approach, of course, is what we said, is traits as just descriptive summaries. So instead of traits being things that are internal to us, or that we might even be born with, that cause us to do things, in this case, traits are descriptive in terms that they just describe the attributes of a person. So they don't necessarily they're not necessarily the cause of our behaviors and our emotions, and our cognitions, but they help describe our cognitions, behaviors, and emotions, and other things might be causing those cognitions, behaviors, and emotions. So when we take this approach, we don't make any assumption about the internality of or the causality of behaviors. We're not saying anything that traits are necessarily dispositional. They don't necessarily belong to us, or that we carry them with us constantly. They're not these things that cause us to act in a certain way, or cause us to think in a certain way, or feel a certain way. Instead, traits kind of just describe how we are in general, right? So personality psychologists who take this type of approach will argue that we must first identify and describe these types of individual differences that are important, and then we can develop causal theories to help explain them. So, in other words, it's not the traits itself that are causing us to act in certain ways. The traits help us describe a set of behaviors or cognitions and emotions, help us organize them, help us describe them, help us make sense of them, and then we can go start looking for the causes of those cognitions, behaviors, and emotions. So the act frequency formulation of traits. This is an illustration of a descriptive summary formulation. So the act frequency formulation takes on the notion that traits are categories of acts, categories of behaviors. We'll probably use the word act or acts because it's actually in the title of this formulation, right? So it starts with the notion that traits are categories. They just describe acts that we engage in, and a trait, something such as dominance, is a descriptive summary of a general trend in somebody's behavior. Being dominant doesn't cause somebody to act in a certain way. Instead, a person acts in a certain way, and we label those types of behaviors or set of behaviors as quote-unquote dominance, right? So this could be a trend that consists of performing a large number of acts within a category relative to other persons. Again, what do we mean by dominance? Even when we take a look at, say, how we would describe a toddler, that's a dominant toddler, that might be very different than how we describe a dominant adult, right? Or someone who identifies as male, how we describe them as dominant might be very different than how we describe someone who identifies as female as dominant. We have to kind of operationalize, what do we mean by dominance, right? What behaviors constitute dominance, and do those behaviors change? So if we're at work and act a certain way in order to, get a raise, or if you're in a managerial position, but you don't act that way at home with your family, are you a dominant person? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? It all really kind of depends how we define dominance. Even within that household type of relationship, what kind of behaviors are going to constitute dominance in there? So the Act Frequency Research Program has got a number of steps that are involved in researching which acts belong to which categories, or how we can categorize certain acts into traits there. So when we could first start off with this idea of act nominations. So first we will think of a category of, let's just take the category of impulsiveness, right? Impulsivity. So we have this category, or this trait, or of impulsiveness. So let's think about the types of behaviors that would exemplify impulsivity, right? So we have to start off with a trait. Think about what kind of behaviors would fit that trait, or what kind of acts fit that trait. So we start thinking what kind of fits into this idea of, say, impulsivity. Well, the next step would be to make what's known as prototypical judgments, right? So prototypicality judgments. So the second step in this type of research program or protocol here involves identifying which acts are most central or most prototypical of the trait category. So going back to our initial example of impulsivity, what acts are most prototypical? And when we mean prototypical, it means what are kind of the first things that you think of when you think of impulsiveness, right? What comes to mind first? So these would be the first acts that come about. And then the final step of this consists of collecting data, start recording act performance. So we start collecting data on actual act performance of individuals in their daily lives. So we begin this process of trying to identify or group acts into various personality traits by first identifying which acts belong to which traits, and then start thinking about which acts are most central to that trait, and then start looking for those types of acts in people's behaviors. And typically that's done through self-report data or through observational data. And observational data could be someone's spouse or a roommate or best friend who's collecting data on them. As we discussed in a previous chapter, the pluses and minuses, benefits and limitations of both types of data there. Now, of course, everything has some criticisms or some limitations associated with it. So when we take a look at one of the critiques for the act frequency formulation, one is that basically it might not successfully capture complex traits. So traits like so say like a person with a narcissistic type of personality or who possesses narcissistic traits, they tend to oscillate between very high self-esteem and very low self-esteem. So where exactly would they fit into this this type of descriptive formulation? How would you describe, how can one trait describe two complete opposite types of behaviors or feelings, right? So one of the major critiques is that this act frequency doesn't really specify how much context should be included in the description of a trait relevant act. So we're not really taking into context, let's say the person who's narcissistic and is feeling really high self-esteem, feeling really good about themselves at one moment, and not feeling really good about themselves at the next moment. Well, this type of formulation, this act frequency formulation, isn't really taking into account what kind of situation they're in, the narcissist, right? So complicated personality traits can't really be neatly put into labels or into boxes there. Also, this act frequency formulation seems applicable to overt actions, but what about failures to act? Or what about covert acts that are not directly observable? So we can't really explain, or using this act frequency formulation just by counting how often somebody is engaging in prototypical types of behaviors of certain trait, it doesn't really explain why somebody would fail to act, right? So we might say that a person who is brave might, stand up to authority or so. But there might be cases of bravery that involve stepping down to authority, or not acting at all, or maybe acting in ways that are more subtle or more covert, that they're not so easily recognizable. Well, the act frequency formulation is going to miss out on them. It's not going to capture, again, the complexity of personality traits. That's not to say that the act frequency formulation hasn't been very helpful. It's been especially helpful in making explicit the behavioral phenomenon to which most trait terms refer. What do we mean? Well, it's been actually really good at kind of describing the types of behaviors that come along with some of these various personality traits that have been proposed. And as we move throughout the semester, you'll see that different personality theorists have speculated and have proposed various numbers of traits and various numbers of different traits. So part of those theories come from taking this approach by which we're looking at what kind of behaviors fit in with these types of personality traits. Because a personality trait, even if it's not causal, we would expect it to be related to some type of personality or some type of behavioral, some type of behavior, some types of acts, right? So other research has demonstrated that the act frequency approach can be used to predict important outcomes in everyday lives, such as your job, your success in your job, what kind of salary that you're going to have, how rapidly people are promoted in business, even the success or failure of relationships and marriages. So even though we have some criticisms that it might not capture the complexity of a lot of personality traits, it certainly has helped us to classify certain behaviors as belonging to or being in line with certain traits, and has also been useful in making meaningful and accurate predictions. So we say helpful in exploring the meaning of some traits that are difficult to study, even like impulsivity and creativity. How do you study creativity? I took a whole class on that from a cognitive perspective, and there's really no simple way to describe creativity, or even the idea of genius. From a cognitive perspective, you're not really born with any type of talent. You might be born with some head start, some predispositions or proclivities that might make it easier for you to do one thing or another. But most of the research on creativity suggests that creativity and expertise means comes with practice. So lots and lots of practice. About 10 years of everyday practice to become an expert in something. Okay, so when it comes to some of the, say, major approaches to identifying the most important traits, we started off by saying, there's tens of thousands of potential personality traits that exist, because personality traits are adjectives of behaviors, of just adjectives of people, right? The way we think, behave, and feel. So we got tens of thousands of adjectives in our language. So there's three major approaches to how we can try to identify the most important traits, the ones that we really should focus on, the ones that really tell us the most about a person. The first is lexical approach. We also have the statistical approach and the theoretical approach, and we'll take a look at each of these in more detail. So when it comes to the lexical approach, sorry, video pause there. Hope it's going now. So as I was saying, when it comes to the lexical approach, the lexical hypothesis says that all important individual differences have become encoded within our natural language. So over time, the differences among people that are important are eventually noticed by other people, and words are invented to talk about those differences, to discuss those differences. So people will invent words such as dominant or creative or reliable, cooperative, so on and so forth, to try to describe the differences that exist between people. And people find these traits, or these terms rather, to be helpful. So usage of these terms to describe these traits are going to spread, and they become common among a group. So the trait terms that are not useful to people will tend to get tossed away. They don't really make it into our language. So one way to examine which traits are important is by examining which descriptive words exist in our language, and not just our language, but across languages, right? So again, trait terms that are helpful in describing people and for communicating about them are gonna stick around. So there are two criteria for identifying important traits. The first is synonym frequency. And what do we mean by that? Well, synonym frequency means that if an attribute has not just one or two adjectives described, or ascribed to it rather, but they have 6 or 10 or 12 adjectives that are ascribed to it, then this is probably an important trait. This is a trait that has a lot of synonyms. There's not just one or two words to describe this type of trait, but there's actually lots of them, right? So we can think about that trait of dominance again. And there's tons of words that try to describe dominance. One is dominant. The other we could think of like bossy or assertive, pushy, powerful, forceful, domineering, authoritative, even arrogant is a form of, say, kind of dominant. So there's tons of different synonyms that are associated with this type of trait of dominance. So according to this lexical hypothesis, if we have a lot of different ways to describe the same type of trait, this must be an important trait, because we're using it quite frequently, and we're finding different ways to try to describe it. Also, cross-cultural universality. So essentially what this means is that the more important trait difference is in human transactions, or the more important it is in human relationships, the more languages are going to have words for it. So, and not just a word for it, but again, almost tying into the synonym frequency. So the more words that are involved to describe a certain trait, and how many languages actually describe this trait in the same kind of level of detail, might also be really important, because number one, if there's a bunch of synonyms, it means we're coming up with a whole bunch of words to describe this type of trait. And you know what? It looks like a whole bunch of other cultures, if not every culture, kind of has a bunch of words to describe this trait as well. So this is probably an important trait according to this lexical approach, right? So this is one way that we can try to figure out what are the important traits. Now, a limitation, of course, is that there are many traits that are ambiguous or metaphorical, that are not necessarily literal. So these terms also, these metaphorical type of terms, have to be identified and excluded, because a lot of people don't really know what they mean. We tend to use words. We're all guilty of it. Tend to use words without really understanding the definition behind them. I remember, like, I think I was in undergraduate school or something, and somebody said that I was being pedantic, and I knew that that was a not a good word in particular, but I thought it meant I was being very thorough, right? It actually meant I was being really arrogantly nitpicky. So it was definitely not good. So of course, when we talk about personality, it's conveyed through different parts of speech. So not just adjectives, but through nouns. Like if we call someone an asshole, okay, most of us will know that that means this is probably not a cool person to be around, but in what way are they an asshole, right? So asshole might not be a good personality trait, and as far as I know, no theories have included that as a trait, except for my own. I say there's two kinds of people in the world: assholes and the rest of us, right? But they include different parts of speech, and sometimes it's not really clear what's being said. Also, the lexical approach is a good starting point for identifying important differences, but it really shouldn't be the only approach that's used. It's very descriptive in nature. There's no real data behind it. We could look back and see, well, we could count how many synonyms there are, or we can count how many languages have terms for this types of behavior, but it's not really all that convincing from a scientific point of view. Good starting point, but we probably want to move on to a statistical approach. So when we take a statistical approach, we actually start off with a really large pool of different personality items in there. So we have a whole list, a whole pool of potential personality traits and characteristics. And how do we get these? Well, most researchers will actually start by using the lexical approach. So they'll start using the lexical approach to try to identify this pool of personality items. Then they'll switch over to a statistical approach to try to use data to pick out the items or the terms or the traits that are really the most important, right? So the goal of the statistical approach is to identify the major dimensions of personality. So on what axes do we exist on? Does personality exist on, let's say? So instead of thinking of personality as individual traits, the statistical approach will often try to approach personality from a continuum type of perspective. And how does it do that? Well, through mostly what's known as factor analysis. And factor analysis is a statistical approach that takes a whole bunch of data, and it could be the behavioral data, self-report data, what have you, about certain personality traits, and examines the correlations and the intercorrelations between these traits and these characteristics and these behaviors in a way to try to narrow them down. So if we just go back to this idea of, say, bossy dominance, like the words that we use, bossy or bitchy or domineering or overbearing or what have you, right? People might say, well, yeah, those are all separate traits, but what factor analysis will do is kind of look for the connections. Take a look for, like, connect the dots between all of them. Is there some hidden factor behind all of these words that we have? That bossy, domineering, bitchy, aggressive type of, all of these types of words, do they have something in common? Is there one trait or one factor that explains all of them? And it doesn't do it by theory or taking a look at how often words are used. It's actually done through factor analysis, which is a statistical approach that kind of narrows things down by saying, well, a person who's described as bossy is also described as being pushy, and there's like a 0.8 or 0.9 correlation between them, those two words. So if you're described as bossy, really good chance you're also described as being pushy. So maybe that's really just the same thing, right? And maybe all of these traits here that we mentioned are really just synonyms for one single factor or one single item, right? So just going back to the slide here, factor analysis will helps identify groups of items that covary or that go together, but tend not to covary with other items. So we're kind of looking at items that kind of stick together. And again, this is after we've collected a bunch of data about people's behaviors or self-report data or observational data about their behaviors or their emotions or their cognitions. What kind of traits or behaviors, cognitions, emotions are kind of going together, and are they forming kind of like separate clusters or separate groups in there? So factor analysis provides a means for determining which personality variables share common properties or belong in the same group, and which are separate from other groups. So this is actually really helpful, really useful in reducing this tens of thousands of different adjectives and descriptive traits into a smaller, more useful set of traits, right? So that we don't have a personality test that is, some of them are incredibly long to begin with. But you can imagine if we're testing for every type of adjective out there that might be used to explain someone's behavior, we're talking, that's insanity at that point, right? That's kind of undoable. You're not able to accomplish that. Factor analysis will say, well, we're going to take those 10,000 traits and we're going to see which of those are sticking together. See how many kind of groups the data is saying actually really exist of those 10,000. Maybe we could distill them down to just 20 items. Or maybe we could, get them down to even just 10 items, right? Of course, if you're familiar or if you remember from intro, just like, the big personality test that has the most scientific or statistical backing to it is the Big Five, which we'll talk about a little bit today, but more so later in the semester. That the Big Five approach actually was based not on theory, not on the lexical approach, but on the statistical approach. Took a whole bunch of data and ran factor analysis, saw what was sticking together, what traits were clumping together, and kind of how many factors were forming, and they came up with 5 of them. we'll take a look and see, how reliable and the Big Five is, and some of the critiques of it. But it was, one of the first personality tests that came from a statistical perspective, or statistical origins, rather. So when we take a look at what a factor loading is, let's say we reduce things down to, say, 5 factors, let's just say, for our sake, as an example. And we might say, okay, one of them is dominance. So this notion of pushiness, right? How much of dominance is explained by being pushy, right? This is what a factor loading is. It's an index of how much variance pushiness is explaining when it comes to dominance, or in other words, how much of dominance can be explained by the trait or the term pushy. How much of dominance can be explained by the trait or the term aggressive, let's say. Well, that's what we would call the factor loading. So how much does aggression, what's the factor loading on dominance? So how much does it load on the factor of dominance? How strongly attached to this factor of dominance is this notion of aggression, or say pushiness, right? So one cautionary note here, if I get my head out of the way. Oh, I missed it. Let me go back here. Well, I keep getting out of here. Bear with me for a moment. Software is okay. So, one cautionary note is that you only get out of factor analysis what you put into it. So factor analysis is really just going to reduce things. So if you're familiar with how whiskey is made, or how vodka is made, how any type of liquor is, spirits are made, you start with a wine, or you start with a beer, and you distill it, right? You concentrate it. It's kind of what factor analysis is. So if you start off with some crappy inputs, you're not going to get a complete picture in terms of the outputs. If you start with bad data, or you're not starting with a thorough data set, your factor analysis might not be that useful. So you need to be really kind of careful or cautious in terms of your initial selection of items that you're going to use for factor analysis. But let's take a quick look at an example of some factor loadings here. Let me see if I can get rid of myself. You can just see the screen. Well, could I go away? Let's see if I could go away. Alright. Should I get rid of myself here a bit? So if you see these factor loadings, here we see 3 different factors that came out of a statistical analysis, and it's kind of cool. I ran a couple of these because I do scale development. So if I come up with 20 items, I want to be sure that these 20 items are all either measuring the same thing, or that they're measuring separate things. So how do I determine that? Through factor analysis. And it'll say, hey Brown, your scale is actually measuring 2 separate things here. You said it's a support for an anti-sexism scale or something, but it looks like it could be an anti-sexism scale and a support for traditional gender belief scale in there. Those are 2 separate things. Those are 2 separate factors, right? And I would be like, well, they sound very similar, but the data is telling me, nope, they're different. People can still like traditional stuff and still be not sexist, right? I don't know how much of that's true. I'm making this up as an example here of what a scale factor analysis might say. So in this example, a bunch of data was inputted into, say, even SPSS. You can do these types of factor analyses, and the program identified 3 factors. So the first personality factor being extroversion, the second one being ambition, and the third one being creativity. So we popped in a whole bunch of different descriptors. So let's say we had some data, ask people, how humorous are you? Or we asked their spouse or friends or roommates, how humorous are they? How amusing, how popular, hardworking, productive, determined, imaginative, original, inventive, and this list can go on and on and on and on and on and on and on, right? For thousands and thousands of these types of adjectives. Well, the computers will, let's say, take all those ratings that we entered in there and say, nope, all of these adjectives that you got going on right here, they're really only describing 3 things: extroversion, ambition, and creativity. And if we take a look at, say, humorous, we see 0.66. This is a factor loading. So if we see 0.66, that's pretty high. That's a pretty decent factor loading right there, right? Compared to factor 2, 0.06, or factor 3, 0.19, clearly humorous belongs to extroversion, this one factor. Amusing as well, 0.65. That's very high compared to 0.23 for ambition or 0.02 for creativity. So looks like these first 3 adjectives all relate to extroversion. These next 3 factors, hardworking, productive, determined, well, let's see, they look like they have some pretty strong factor loadings on factor number 2, ambition, right? Pretty low on creativity there, pretty low on extroversion. You can think of these in terms of correlations, if that'll help. These are really low, right? But not bad for factor 2. Let me get my head out of the way here. And then for factor 3, imaginative, original, inventive, take a look over there at factor 3, creativity. 0.62, 0.53, 0.47. Compared to the loadings on the other 2 factors, it looks like those 3 adjectives, imaginative, original, inventive, all belong to creativity. So factor analysis is kind of cool in the sense that it's able to say, yeah, no, these things are all kind of measuring just the same thing, right? So you're able to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wait, I missed it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different adjectives and say, nope, they're really just measuring 3 things. Is it 10? 9 in there. 1, 2, 3, 9. I overcounted. Okay, I have a tiny little screen on my laptop and then this big old screen right up in front of me here. So after the statistical approach, we also have the theoretical approach. And the theoretical approach certainly comes up with the most interesting theories, I would say. But in contrast to the statistical approach, which can be described as atheoretical, there's really no theory in the statistical approach. We're kind of just letting the data speak for itself. With the theoretical approach, we actually start with a theory. We start with what we expect to see. We start with a judgment. So we're kind of prejudiced in the literal sense. We're prejudging what we expect to find in this regard. So when we talk about the theoretical strategy, it dictates in a highly specific manner which variables we're supposed to measure and which ones we're not supposed to measure. So let's take a Freudian, so somebody who subscribes to the psychoanalytic theory. So to a Freudian, it would be critical to measure, let's say, the oral personality or the anal personality, because these two personality traits are really important theory-driven constructs. In psychoanalysis, this is kind of the beginning of how personality develops through these psychosocial sexual stages, right? So when it comes to, and we'll rank on Freud a little bit this semester, but even Maslow's theory of self-actualization, it's not based on any type of statistical approach. Maslow came up with a theory of self-actualization and a theory of needs, a hierarchy of needs before we could reach, self-actualization. But it was based on theory. There's no real data behind any of it, or at least not in the beginnings. People have since tried to, come up with statistical or empirical evidence to support this type of hierarchy of needs. But we see here that your textbook speaks about the example of the socio-sexual orientation, right? So in the theory of the socio-sexual orientation, which was developed by Simpson and Gangestad and some others who came behind them to try to validate the theory and test the theory. According to this theory, men and women will pursue one of two alternate sexual relationship strategies. So the first is that a single committed relationship is they will try to pursue a single committed relationship that's characterized by monogamy and a lot of investment in having children. Or the second sexual strategy is characterized by more promiscuity, more partner switching, and less investment in children, or the idea of having children even to begin with. But because this theory of the socio-sexual orientation dictates the mating strategy that one pursues as being critical, or as being a critical difference between people, the people who develop it have kind of developed a measure of socio-sexual orientation in and of itself. In other words, they kind of, it's a bit of circular reasoning going on in there, right? The theory says, well, there are two approaches. You're going to be monogamous and committed and devoted to having kids, or you're kind of going to be more of a swinger type and less interested in having kids. And that's what the theory suggests, and that's what we're going to measure. Okay, are you measuring anything that your theory doesn't suggest? And how would you come up with those two orientations? Aren't you maybe missing a whole bunch of orientations? Well, no, because when we measure these orientations, we find support for them. Well, yeah, because those are the only two orientations you're measuring, right? So we kind of get into the Freudian thing, is that this stuff might not always be falsifiable, or even if it's falsifiable, it might have started off with a lot of bias or even confirmation bias to begin with, right? So the strengths of this type of approach coincide with the strengths of the theory. So your approach to measurements are going to be only as good as your theory, and the weaknesses are going to be just as bad as your weaknesses. And of course, some theories are better than others. That we have noticed, right? This is just an example of one of the questionnaires that is used for that type of sociosexual orientation there. I'll just leave it on the screen for a second or so, and you can tell me if this is actually tapping into two distinct type of orientations. So let's take a look at the first one. So how many different partners have you had sexual or intercourse with in the past year? Okay, I mean, what if you're having a really dry year, or coming out of, if you were in a monogamous relationship for many years, that ended, and you're just getting your freak on now as a way of trying to get over this person. Maybe that number there is not completely accurate in terms of your social or sexual orientation. As we could see with a bunch of these things, how often do you fantasize about having sex with someone other than your current partner? Well, I would suggest you all take a human sexuality class that I teach, and you'll see this is almost always right for both men and women, and everyone in between, particularly as a relationship goes on, or as a relationship grows older. There's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean anyone's any less committed to the other person, or is in any way looking to cheat, or less invested in their kids or anything like that. So, as you can tell, I'm not a huge fan of that type of approach. Okay, so evaluating these approaches for identifying the important traits in practice, personality researchers are going to use a combination of all three approaches: the lexical approach, the statistical approach, and the theoretical approach. We see a couple of researchers here who have started with the lexical strategy to first identify a set of variables to include, and include into a factor analysis, right? So sometimes that lexical approach is a good way to kind of identify your item pool that you're going to collect data on, and then run statistical analyses on. So using this type of strategy actually solves a couple of problems for us here, right? So it solves the problem of identifying the key domains of individual differences. So we're able to use the lexical approach. Let's get some ideas going in there. And those ideas might just be, let's use the words that people use most frequently. It also solves the problem of describing the structure that exists among individual differences that are identified. Why? Well, because you're going to have factor analysis that's going to tell you the structure of the individual differences that exist. So when you identify those differences, factor analysis is going to tell you what kind of differences are there and how strong those differences are. Okay, so when we talk about different taxonomies of personality, Eysenck's hierarchical model of personality is something we'll talk about. The circumplex taxonomy of personality, which includes the Wiggins circumplex, which is a fancy name for circular or circle, and then of course the 5-factor model, which we'll come back to later in this semester. So Eysenck's hierarchical model of personality. This model of personality is based on traits that Eysenck believed were that we were born with, that we inherited, and they had this psychophysiological foundation, which means that they're rooted in biology, rooted in our genes, or in the way that our brains form. And according to him, there were three main traits that met this criteria that we were born with, that were likely, passed down through our genes and rooted in biology. And these traits were extroversion and introversion. And we can see some of the first two, at least, being on a spectrum there, or on polar opposites. So extroversion versus introversion, neuroticism versus emotional stability, and psychoticism. So taking a look at extroversion, I'll get rid of myself again if I can. High scorers are people who enjoy parties, have many friends, like to have people around to talk to, like playing practical jokes on each other or on others, displays carefree and easy manner, and have a high activity level. So when we think of extroverted people, we all kind of know what that means. These are like the more outgoing people compared to, say, introverted people who are more the loner types, more shy, more keep to themselves, so on and so forth. When we speak of neuroticism, people high on this neuroticism scale or high in neuroses are worriers, so they will tend to have a lot of generalized type of anxiety. If you think about the worst case scenario, they're usually depressed and very anxious. They might have trouble sleeping, might have trouble dealing with negative emotions. They might actually overreact to bad situations, and they might actually have more psychosomatic symptoms. So psychosomatic symptoms are bodily pains that we feel, but are rooted actually in anxiety in the brain and in the mind. And psychoticism, so people who score high on this trait tend to be solitary individuals. They'll tend to lack empathy and are often cruel and inhumane. They'll have a penchant for the strange and the unusual, and they'll tend to be more impulsive and have antisocial tendencies. I don't like that third one there. I love the strange and unusual, and I'm not a psycho. I'm a sociopath, not a psychopath. Oh my god. We have to take a look at some of these sometimes. The penchant for the strange and unusual could also make for a good professor, right? Or a good scientist. Not just a good psychopath. They're not mutually exclusive, though. You could be a psychopath and a professor and a scientist at the same time. Okay, so let's take a look at a little bit at this hierarchical goal structure. And I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit because I know my lectures are long. So when we take a look at this hierarchical structure of Eysenk's system, these super traits of psychoticism and extroversion and neuroses are at the top. And then we have narrower traits that are placed in the second level, and then each narrow trait then has a third level. And these tend to contain habitual type of acts. So it's types of habits or behaviors that are associated with these second level type of traits. So at the lowest level of this 4-tier hierarchy are actual specific behaviors or specific traits, or specific acts, rather. I'll show you a diagram of this in a moment here. But this hierarchy has the advantage of locating each specific personality relevant act within this increasingly precise and nested type of model, a nested system. So if we start off with say, psychoticism, right? This being at the top. There might be narrower traits from, say, lack of empathy, and this might be assumed with, say, habitual types of acts, may contain habitual types of acts, habits, and type of proclivities. So, people not really caring. So lack of empathy. So people not really caring or showing much interest. And then the lowest level, specific act of dismissing a crying person or laughing at a crying person. We could think of that as kind of a four-tiered system. So looking at this this structure of psychoticism in the book that I got this from here, we could see that the hierarchical structure starts with psychoticism as being that first level type of trait, and then we have some other second level traits that are associated with this: aggression, coldness, egocentrism, being impersonal or being impulsive. Third level traits can be antisocial, unempathetic, creative, tough-minded, and then on the fourth level would be actual specific behavior. So an antisocial behavior, robbing a store, lighting a building on fire, arson, murder, bank robbery, you name it, right? Tons of potential fourth level types of acts in there. So just some notes here that I have on the side. The person who scores higher in this psychoticism scale is typically a solitary individual, often described by others as being a loner, because he or she might lack empathy. He or she thus may be cruel or inhumane. Men tend to score twice as high as women do on the psychoticism scale. Remember, this is a spectrum, so it could be high or low, and somewhere in between. And people, very high in psychoticism will often have a history of cruelty to animals. As we said before, they often tend to be interested in the strange and unusual, which I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that, because I think I am strange and unusual myself, right? But they tend to also have antisocial tendencies, so they like to or get pleasure out of making people feel bad about themselves, making fools out of other people, or actually engaging in behaviors that might resemble antisocial personality disorder, so severe behavioral problems. When we take a look at the structure for extroversion and introversion, this is something we're typically most people are more familiar with. We know these terms a little better here. So extroversion being a level 1 trait, and we could see some of the level 2 traits, some of the level 3 traits, and the level 4 traits, of course, would be the specific behaviors that are associated with this. So it might be, going to parties, meeting new people, so on and so forth. On the neuroticism scale, so one thing that people often, get confused with, or mixed up or used interchangeably are the terms of neuroses and psychoses, right? So neuroticism typically involves anxiousness or relates to anxiousness. When we talk about psychoses, we're talking about losing touch with reality, delusions, hallucinations, so on and so forth. So neuroticism, this trait, tends to have or it tends to include things like being anxious, being depressed, having feelings of guilt, low self-esteem, tension. Some of the third level traits, being irrational, being shy, moody, emotional, and of course we all have varying levels of this, right? One of the jokes, whether it's in good taste or a poor taste, but if you have depression and anxiety, hopefully you'll recognize the joke is that it's my friends and I always used to make when we would check in with each other, and it's like, how you feeling? Like shit. Then we're like, okay, well, at least you're not insane, you're not crazy, right? Why? Well, because you're just neurotic. It means like you're still in touch with the reality. You know enough to know that you're not well, right? It's the people who have severe problems who don't know that they have severe problems is when you need to start to worry. High levels of neuroticism clearly are not good. Anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, these are not good characteristics, but they certainly don't reach a level of losing touch with reality, even though severe anxiety, severe depression sometimes can lead to some feel or some traits of psychosis in there. So speaking of, or continuing along, finishing up, Eysenck's hierarchical model of personality, we said that before, that there are these biological underpinnings to these major basic dimensions of personality. So he identified these three: psychoticism, extroversion, neuroticism. When we take a look at what the research finds, seems to be some moderate connection to heredity, but so do a whole bunch of other traits, right? These are not the only traits that have some biological basis or genetic basis there. Psychological traits also should have identifiable psychological traits, and these he kind of said this idea that if you're going to come up with a theory of personality, things should be organized in a way that makes sense, right? This idea of identifiable psychological self-traits. It shouldn't just be willy-nilly like some of Freud's personality theories there. Of course, some of the limitations to Eysenck's model is that many other personality traits show heritability, as I said, and he actually might have missed some important traits that the Big Five actually picked up on, which we'll get to in a second here. We'll talk about the next taxonomy here is the Wiggum's circumplex, and basically in the 20th century, the two most prominent advocates of this type of circular representation of personality were Timothy Leary, who was a psychiatrist at Harvard, who was really influential in the hippie movement and in the LSD movement and LSD experiments at Harvard. So he's a big name in the hippie culture. And Jerry Wiggins, who formalized the circular model with modern statistical techniques. So as I said before, the circumplex is really kind of just a fancy name for a circle, but Wiggins started with the lexical approach, or the lexical assumption. So the idea that all the important differences that exist between us actually exist in our language, and that we can kind of identify which traits are important by studying, how many synonyms there are for these traits in our language, and how many other languages have similar traits or words that describe these traits. So one kind of individual differences pertains to what people do, and what they, let's say, one type of individual difference is what we do and what we do with other people, let's say. So in this type of interpersonal traits, according to Wiggins, and this other kind of individual differences are specified by the following types of traits. So essentially temperament traits, so things that deal with, say, nervousness or gloominess. So when we say someone is temperamental, what are we saying? We're kind of saying they're kind of moody, they're kind of easily pissed off. Also, Wiggins argued that character traits were also important. So things such as being moral, or having principles, being honest. Material traits, so like describing people as cheap or stingy or generous, let's say. Attitude traits, which dealt more with people's political beliefs in terms of egalitarianism, or even their spirituality, could fall into these types of attitude traits. Mental traits, such as being clever or logical, or perspective, or having perspective, right? And physical traits, which dealt with things like being healthy and being tough, strong. Not sure how physical traits fit in with personality traits directly, but Wiggins, certainly included them and saw them as important. So Wiggins was concerned with these interpersonality traits and carefully separated these out. So he defined defined interpersonal as interactions among people that involve different types of exchanges. And two of the resources that define social exchanges are love and status, according to Wiggins. So to Wiggins, interpersonal events may be defined as didactic interactions that have relatively clear-cut social, meaning status, and emotional, meaning love, consequences for both of the people involved. So the dimensions of status and love are what defined Wiggins' circumplex. So you can see how this came out of the hippie movement with Timothy Leary. Might have both been dropping acid together here, right? I'm only teasing, of course. No condemnation of Wiggins' theory here. But you can see that he would place different types of personalities based on these two axes here of status and love. So let's see, on the x-axis, we have love and cold-heartedness at one end, and when it comes to status, we would have a dominant type of axis at one, or dominant type of characters at one end, and submissiveness at the other end. And if you take a look at the different types of characteristics, personality characteristics that Wiggins came up with, they all kind of fall in somewhere on these two axes here, right? So taking a look at warm and agreeable, this is a person who is definitely on the love side, but somewhere in between when it comes to status. Somewhere, actually, right in between, right smack in between. Same when it comes to cold-heartedness, right? Somebody's lacking in love, but pretty even-keeled or middle ground when it comes to status there. So the Wiggins circumplex has three key advantages. One, that it provides an explicit definition of what constitutes interpersonal behavior. He gave us those two axes there. It specifies relationships between each trait and every other trait within the model. The problem we'll see here is that it's only limited to 2 dimensions, right? So although it can alert investigators to gaps in investigations of interpersonal behavior, kind of let us know where we're missing when it comes to research or theory development, by seeing what's missing on that diagram, on those plots. Personality, we all tend to agree now, is should be measured on more than just two axes here. So it was pretty limited in terms of what it actually explained. And of course, other traits may have important interpersonal consequences, not just status in love. Moving along to the 5-factor model, also known as the Big Five. This is a more comprehensive and quote-unquote modern taxonomy that includes these dimensions that are listed here, these 5 broad factors. Again, these factors came out of factor analysis. So a lexical approach was used to identify a whole bunch of potential adjectives. A bunch of research was collected, data was collected on these adjectives, and factor analysis was used, and not just in a single study, but over a course of several studies. These 5 broad factors tend to emerge, tend to be quite consistent in terms of emerging. The first being extroversion, the second being agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to new experience, sometimes referred to as intellect, or openness and intellect. So the Big Five taxonomy, oops, let me just go back to that slide. The Big Five taxonomy, why does this keep messing with me? Has achieved a greater degree of consensus than any other trait taxonomy in the history of personality trait psychology. So it's kind of where it's at right now. This is the generally accepted model of personality, and it's really the only one that has a significant amount of statistical and empirical backing to it. When we take a look at the different markers, so some of the different markers that make up the Big Five here, we can see when it comes to extroversion, a person could be seen as talkative or more silent, more sociable or more reclusive, more open or more secret. When it comes to agreeableness, some of the traits that come in here, some of the factor loadings, let's say, good-natured or irritable, cooperative versus negativistic, mild or gentle versus headstrong, jealous versus not jealous, conscientiousness, being responsible or being undependable, scrupulous versus unscrupulous, right? So being honest versus being not so honest, being fussy and tidy versus being careless. When it comes to emotional stability, calmness versus anxiety or anxiousness, composed versus being excitable, not hypochondriacal versus being hypochondriacal. And if you are unfamiliar with that word, probably familiar with the word hypochondriac, which comes from hypochondriasis. It's a fear of having illness or health anxiety. And this fifth factor, which actually is a little bit controversial here, but this idea of culture or intellect or openness to experience. So intellectual versus unreflective or narrow, artistic versus non-artistic, polished and refined versus crude and brutish. You can see by just some of these how socioeconomic conditions might actually affect some of these types of factor loadings, and not necessarily personality, right? That might be something outside of a person's control that's causing those things. So the five-factor model, again, there's lots of empirical evidence for the model. It's replicable in studies using English language trait words as items, found by more than a dozen researchers using different samples. So it's been highly replicable, highly replicated even in different languages, replicated in every decade for the past 50 years, right? Suggesting that it's replicable over time. It seems to have a lot of stability associated with it. And it's replicated using different item formats. So even when we swap out, say, the items for similar items, but not the same exact items, but similar ones, these five factors still seem to emerge in the statistical analysis, in the factor analyses that are done. Again, we have that issue with that fifth factor, is that there's some disagreement about the content and replicability of that fifth factor. And as we go back and see, what does intellect even mean? What does intelligence even mean? That's debatable. There's no good definition or single definition of intelligence. There's theories of multiple intelligences. This idea of being cultured or refined versus brutish. Some of that might come with money and social status, right? So another question that we have to ask is whether or not the five-factor model is comprehensive. Remember, it did start from a lexical approach, so the analyses, the factors that come out of it are really only as good as the items that we put into it. And some things might have been left out of this model. So possible omissions, things that aren't in there. Positive evaluation, negative evaluation, a spirituality or religiosity factor, an attractiveness factor, not necessarily physical attractiveness, but say emotional attractiveness, and sexuality, which I think is undeniable, plays a huge role in human behaviors and in our lives. According to Freud, it's kind of the most important factor, and it's not anywhere in here. So again, maybe the initial item pool didn't include items related to these types of factors or characteristics. So they weren't included in the factors because they weren't included in the initial pool. So one thing that you have to be very careful with when doing factor analysis is that you have a really extensive, comprehensive pool of items. Otherwise, you run the risk of missing out on potential things. But just to give you a sampling here, I have some notes in terms of what's associated with, say, some of these 5 factors. If we take a look at those, good grades in school are best predicted by being high in conscientiousness and emotional stability. So people who are more conscientious and more emotionally stable tend to do better in school. That was one study. One reason might be that emotional stability and conscientious people are less likely to procrastinate, so they're more likely to, be motivated and get things done. Risky sexual behaviors, such as having many sexual partners without using any type of protection, are best described by being highly extroverted, high neuroticism, low conscientiousness, and low agreeableness. So this was actually found in 2 separate studies there. So people who engage in more risky sexual behavior tend to be more extroverted, more neurotic or higher in neuroticism, lower in conscientiousness, and lower in agreeableness. Alcohol consumption is best predicted by high extroversion and low conscientiousness. So people who are more extroverted but lower in conscientiousness are more likely to consume alcohol. And a study of more than 5,000 workers in Finland found that low conscientiousness also predicts increase in alcohol consumption over time. That is, we're able to determine, or low levels of conscientiousness were able to predict who would become a heavy drinker over time. Also, proclivity to engage in volunteer work, such as campus or community services, is best predicted by a combination of high agreeableness and high extroversion. Forgiveness, so this is the proclivity to forgive those who have committed some wrong against us, is characteristic of individuals who are high on agreeableness and high on emotional stability. So again, when it comes to this idea of whether the 5-factor model is comprehensive, it might be missing out on some important characteristics of personality, because those initial adjective traits were never really included, so they couldn't end up on a factor. But these 5 factors, as I've given you some examples, have done a fairly good job at predicting behaviors, right? And behavioral outcomes are kind of the gold standard for when we determine whether or not something is good at predicting something. Does it actually? Can we actually see it? Do we notice a difference in behaviors, rather than just someone telling us that I volunteer all the time? It's much more reliable for us to actually see them volunteering, or to have someone else watching them volunteer or report back to us that they've been volunteering. So just summarizing the chapter here, the main takeaways are that there are different approaches to how we identify these important personality traits, and we went through a couple of different ways: the lexical approach, the statistical approach, the theoretical approach. Homeostasis statistician, methods person, so I'm biased. I'm going to say the statistical approach is the best way, but of course you can't really even get to the statistical approach without going through the lexical approach. And I'm not going to totally poo-poo the theoretical approach. We'll see some value in that in chapters that are coming up. Another take-home message is that personality psychologists will oftentimes use a blend of all three of these types of approaches. It's better to be comprehensive and to, again, not dismiss any one approach because you risk missing. I've been talking way too long already. You risk missing out on something. Taking multiple approaches is typically a good idea, especially when you're dealing with something as complicated as personality. And formulating an overarching taxonomy of personality traits is fundamental. Should be a take-home here, is that we really do need to have an understanding of how these personality traits are organized, because in order for them to make sense, and in order for us to be able to make predictions, we have to understand how they work. So having a taxonomy, having a way of identifying or even creating different levels of personality traits and different characteristics that make up that personality trait is critical in order for us to understand how personality works, and even how many personality traits there even are, let alone how many behaviors are related to those traits. So that's it for me. That ends the lecture. I will meet you all next week. We'll have another lecture, and hopefully we'll have a live discussion as well that I can answer some questions for you and get a discussion going. Okay, have a great week. I'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.